The desert had a way of swallowing men whole. The heat bled down from the heavens, unrelenting, while the wind carried nothing but dust and silence. Across that vast emptiness, a ragged caravan pushed forward, horses foaming, riders hunched low in their saddles, their eyes squinting against the blaze of the sun. They were men drawn by whispers, chasing a promise that had ruined better men before them. Somewhere out here, they believed, lay a canyon filled with rivers of gold. Jedediah McGraw rode at the head, the sun setting fire to the scar that ran from his temple to the corner of his jaw. A soldier once, a drifter after, Jed had learned that the frontier only offered two things, survival or death. Now he chased something more elusive, fortune. Behind him trailed a motley crew, Hank Rollins, quick with a revolver and quicker with his temper, the boy Elias, barely 17, eyes wide with the hope of a life bigger than his father's broken farm in Kansas, the Reyes brothers, fugitives with the law's noose forever snapping at their heels, and a bitter ex-preacher named Cole, who muttered scripture by firelight as though bargaining with God for a redemption he'd never earn. The trail was long, but the fever that burned in their veins carried them forward. Every town along the way had added fuel to their madness. Drunken gamblers swearing they'd seen nuggets the size of fists, whores whispering tales of men who'd vanished into the desert and never returned, and prospectors who'd died with dirt under their fingernails and gold dust on their tongues. Most men scoffed. But Jed and his riders? They believed. As twilight stretched its fingers across the land, the riders found themselves staring into the mouth of a narrow pass. The rocks glowed crimson in the dying sun, and the air grew cooler as shadows crawled up the canyon walls. Jed slowed his horse, his gut tightening with a strange hush that fell over the place. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of something watching. And then it happened. The boy Elias, riding near the back, cried out. On the wall of the canyon, just beneath a jagged outcrop, a glimmer caught the light. It wasn't the trick of the sun. It was gold, pure and undeniable, streaked through the rock like frozen lightning. The men scrambled from their saddles, clawing at the stone with bare hands, laughter and shouts echoing through the canyon. Hank Rollins struck his pick against the wall, and a chunk of stone tumbled free, spilling into his hands a nugget as big as his thumb. His wild grin gleamed in the firelight. "Boys," he rasped, holding it aloft, "the desert just paid its debts." For a moment, they stood together, united by awe, their hunger rising like wildfire. But even as the fever took hold, Jed felt the weight of the canyon pressing down on him. The gold seemed too easy, too perfect, as if the earth itself was offering bait. And above them, unseen, shadows moved against the darkening sky. The Ute scouts crouched silent on the ridges, their faces painted in war colors, their eyes cold as they watched the strangers tear greedily at sacred ground. By the time the campfires burned low, the men were drunk on dreams. Nuggets lay scattered across blankets and saddlebags, each rider claiming he'd staked the richest claim. But Jed lay awake, staring at the stars, feeling the fever take root in every man around him. He knew the truth about gold. It never brought men together. It only tore them apart. The night carried voices. Low chants, mournful and unbroken, drifting on the wind. Jed sat up, heart thundering, certain they didn't belong to his men. He scanned the ridges, seeing nothing but shadows. Still, the sound lingered, like a warning whispered straight from the bones of the earth. When dawn broke, the canyon glowed with fresh fire, but something was wrong. Elias's bedroll lay empty, his horse missing. In its place, atop his blanket, sat a single nugget of gold, catching the morning sun. The boy was gone without a trace. No footprints, no struggle, just silence. Jed's stomach turned to stone. He knew then the desert had claimed its first rider. The canyon was not silent that morning. It was restless. Horses snorted and pawed at the ground, their eyes rolling white at the strange scent that lingered in the cool dawn air. The men moved stiffly, their nerves raw from Elias's disappearance, each of them watching the shadows along the ridges as if expecting the boy to stagger back bloody, or not at all. Jedediah McGraw stood at the canyon's edge, one boot grinding into the gravel as his eyes followed the horizon. He wanted to believe Elias had simply grown scared, that the boy had packed his bedroll, taken his horse, and ridden off before anyone could stop him. But Jed knew better. He'd seen enough battlefields, enough blood trails, enough disappearances to understand when something unnatural had happened. The desert had teeth, and last night it had bitten. Behind him, Hank Rollins spat into the dust, his revolver twirling at his side. "Kid's gone and run off, Jed. Took his share of gold and bolted. Happens every time you let children play at being men." His voice carried the smugness of a wolf sniffing weakness. Jed turned, his scar catching the light. "Elias wasn't a thief." Hank snorted. "You think he just vanished? No tracks. No fight. Just gone. Either he stole off in the night, or—" he leaned in, lowering his voice with a mock shiver, "or the canyon swallowed him whole." The Reyes brothers chuckled darkly, muttering in Spanish, but their laughter was brittle. Even they weren't so bold as to ignore the unease creeping through camp. Cole, the ex-preacher, sat sharpening a bowie knife, his lips moving in silent prayer. No one could tell whether he prayed for Elias, or for himself. The morning was heavy with suspicion, the gold fever eating through them like rot. Men clutched their saddlebags closer, counting and recounting what nuggets they'd clawed from the canyon wall. Already, Jed could see the fever changing them, turning friends into rivals, allies into threats. The boy's disappearance was only fuel on the fire. Then came the warning. It was near midday when the arrow landed. A sharp whistle cut through the canyon air, and a crimson-feathered shaft buried itself deep in the dirt at the center of camp. The men scrambled for their weapons, revolvers and rifles gleaming in the sun as they spun toward the ridges. Nothing moved but heat waves. No voices. No war cries. Just the arrow, quivering in the earth like a promise of death. Cole picked it up, examining the paint smeared along its shaft. "Blood red," he whispered. "A mark of war." Jed's jaw clenched. He knew what it meant. The Ute had given their warning. They'd been watched since the first nugget struck the dirt. Elias hadn't left on his own. The boy had been taken. Hank scoffed, though his hands twitched restlessly near his revolver. "So what now, Jed? You planning to parley with painted savages? Maybe trade a him and a handshake for safe passage? Or you finally gonna admit we're sitting ducks here?" Jed ignored him, but his silence was dangerous fuel. Hank saw the uncertainty and pressed harder. "Look around, boys. This canyon ain't ours. Never was. We dig, they kill us. We stay, they bleed us dry one by one. The only way out is through." The men muttered in agreement. Gold fever had their minds clouded, but fear made them desperate. Jed felt the tide shifting against him. By evening, tension broke like a thunderclap. It started with shouting, Hank and one of the Reyes brothers arguing over a sack of nuggets. Accusations flew, voices rising, until Hank drew his revolver and jammed it against the man's chest. For a long second, no one breathed. Then Jed's hand was there, fast as lightning, pressing Hank's gun aside. "Put it down," Jed growled, his voice carrying the weight of command. But Hank's eyes burned with fever, and in that fire Jed saw the truth. It wasn't about gold anymore. It was about power. Hank wanted control, and he was willing to spill blood to take it. The fight ended without shots, but the damage was done. The riders slept that night with one eye open, hands never far from their weapons. Every flicker of the fire cast shadows that looked like enemies. Every rustle in the brush carried Elias's ghost. Then, at dawn, the canyon spoke again. The crack of a rifle echoed across the stone walls, sharp as thunder. One of the Reyes brothers jerked upright, blood blooming from his chest. He collapsed beside the fire, eyes wide in shock, a crimson stain spreading through the dust beneath him. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed, men dove for cover, rifles fired blindly at the ridges. But the enemy remained unseen, their shots cold and precise. Jed dragged the dying man to cover, his hands slick with blood, but it was useless. The brothers' last breath rattled out, carried off by the desert wind. And there, in the growing panic, Jed realized the nightmare had begun. The Ute were not just watching, they were hunting. And Elias, if he still lived, he was caught in the middle of it. As the sun rose high, painting the canyon walls in blood-red light, Jed met Hank's wild eyes across the fire. Both men knew the truth, though neither spoke it aloud. The canyon would devour them all before it gave up its gold. The next shot rang out, closer this time. Dust kicked up inches from Jed's boots. He dove for his rifle, shouting orders, but the men were no longer listening. Fear had broken them. Somewhere, hidden on the canyon ridge, The unseen shooter cocked his rifle again, steady and patient. The riders scrambled, shouting, firing blind into the rocks. And in that moment, Jed knew the real enemy wasn't just the ute or the hunger for gold, it was the fever burning inside every man. Then came the final shot, louder, closer, like a hammer striking the earth. The canyon fell silent again. Jed turned, searching the smoke and dust, his heart hammering in his chest. And what he saw froze him where he stood. Hank Rollins was standing over him, revolver drawn, smoke curling from the barrel. His eyes were wild, his grin twisted. And though the echo of the rifle still lingered in the canyon, Jed realized with dawning horror, this last shot hadn't come from the ridges. It had come from inside the camp. The desert stretched out in all directions, an endless ocean of ochre dust and jagged stone, until it finally gave way to a settlement that clung to survival like a coyote on a bone. Dusty Creek was little more than a cluster of buildings battered by sun and wind, a weather-beaten church with a leaning steeple, a sheriff's office with a single barred window, 24 scattered shacks, and the heart of it all, the Silver Spur Saloon, where whiskey flowed like water and secrets changed hands faster than bullets. The town's main street was a wide scar of dirt, trampled by hooves and wagon wheels, where tumbleweeds rolled like restless ghosts. It was the kind of place where men's eyes narrowed at strangers, where law hung by a fraying thread, and where the wrong word could get you killed before sundown. Dusty Creek had been born of silver and cattle, but now it lived in the shadow of whispers, rumors of gold hidden somewhere in the Badlands, guarded by both savages and specters. Sheriff Thomas Kane stood on the boardwalk outside his office, coat unbuttoned against the dry wind. He was not a tall man, nor especially broad, but there was something about him that quieted arguments and froze drunken brawls. His eyes, pale as a winter sky, missed nothing. He wore his badge reluctantly, as though it weighed more than iron, and his revolver sat heavy on his hip, a weapon he swore to use only when justice demanded it. That morning, Kane watched as a trio of strangers rode in from the east. Their horses were gaunt, their faces half hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, but the way they carried themselves told him everything he needed. Outlaws. The kind of men who lived by the gun and fed on desperation. Dusty Creek had seen its share of drifters, but something in Kane's gut warned him these men were not here for drink or rest. They were hunting something. Or someone. Across the street, the Silver Spur's doors banged open, spilling out the sound of a piano and rough laughter. A woman leaned in the doorway, framed by smoke and lamplight. Delilah Byrne, queen of the Spur, had ruled its smoky halls for nearly a decade. Her hair was dark as a raven's wing, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. Men crossed deserts to see her, to hear her laugh, to fall beneath her gaze, and many left broken when they mistook kindness for love. But Delilah was no ordinary saloon girl. Beneath the silks and painted lips lay a mind sharper than any blade. She knew every rumor before it reached the street, every deal made in shadow, every betrayal whispered over whiskey. If Dusty Creek had a heart, it beat inside the Silver Spur, and Delilah's hand was always on the pulse. That night, as the strangers slipped into her saloon, Kane followed. He wasn't there for whiskey. He wanted ears on the ground, eyes in the smoke, and answers before trouble grew teeth. Inside, the Silver Spur was alive. Miners sang drunken ballads, cowhands slammed cards on tables, and a haze of tobacco smoke curled beneath the chandeliers. Delilah moved among them like a queen among beggars, her laughter soft, her eyes watchful. When she saw Kane step through the doors, her smile widened with something between amusement and warning. "Sheriff," she purred, gliding toward him, "you never come for the whiskey. So what's brought you to my kingdom tonight?" "Trouble." Kane's eyes flicked to the strangers at the corner table. They drank in silence, their hats low, their hands never straying far from their belts. "Trouble's already here," he murmured. "I just aim to find out what kind." Delilah's gaze followed his, and for a moment her mask slipped. She knew them, or at least their kind. She leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Those men don't ride into towns for rest, Kane. They ride in like wolves. Hungry ones. And wolves don't leave until they've fed." As the night deepened, Kane's unease grew. The strangers didn't gamble, didn't drink more than a swallow. They sat waiting, listening. Their eyes shifted each time a prospector stumbled in from the trail, their jaws tight as if weighing which throat to cut first. Kane had seen bounty hunters before, Mercenaries with no loyalty but to coin, and every instinct told him these were bloodhounds on a trail. It was near midnight when the first shot rang out. The piano stopped mid-note, glasses shattered, men dove for cover as gunfire cracked through the saloon. One of the strangers lay on the floor, blood blooming across his chest, his chair overturned. The other two had their guns drawn before anyone could breathe, eyes sweeping the crowd. Kane's revolver was already in his hand, steady as stone. "Hold it!" he barked, his voice slicing through the chaos. But the second stranger snarled, his eyes burning. "They're here. Jed McGraw's men, one of you bastards put him down." His voice carried madness, desperation. Kane's heart froze. Jed McGraw. The name carried like thunder across the frontier. A Civil War veteran turned drifter, hardened by blood and loss. If the strangers hunted Jed, it meant something darker than bounty, something tied to the rumors of gold, to the canyon no man dared speak of aloud. Delilah moved fast, faster than anyone expected. She grabbed Kane's arm, her eyes flashing. "You can't let them bring that fire here, Sheriff. Dusty Creek won't survive it." But before Kane could answer, the third stranger fired. The bullet shattered a whiskey bottle inches from Delilah's head, showering her in glass and liquor. The saloon erupted in screams, chairs overturned, men stampeded for the door. Kane's revolver roared, the shot punching the gun from the outlaw's hand. But the damage was done. Blood had been spilled in Dusty Creek, and the trail had come crashing into town like a storm. The surviving outlaw staggered back, eyes wild. "Jed's gold," he spat, "belongs to us. And we'll burn this town to ash before we let him keep it." The words hit like a hammer, silencing even the screams. Jed's gold. Kane exchanged a glance with Delilah, whose face had gone pale. She knew more than she'd let on. Kane could see it. The outlaw fled into the night, leaving blood on the saloon floor and fear in every corner of Dusty Creek. Kane holstered his revolver, jaw clenched. He'd kept peace in this town for years, but he knew now the old balance was broken. The storm that began in some hidden canyon was rolling toward Dusty Creek, and no badge, no whiskey, no whispered deal in a smoky saloon could hold it back. Delilah touched his arm, her voice low and urgent. "You don't understand, Kane. If Jed McGraw's name is on their tongues, it means the fever's real. The gold is real. And men will kill us all to get it." Outside, the desert wind howled through the empty streets, carrying dust and omen. Somewhere in the darkness, hoofbeats thundered faintly. Whether they belonged to hunters, fugitives, or ghosts, no one could say. But Dusty Creek would never sleep easy again. And as dawn crept over the desert, Sheriff Kane stood at the edge of town, watching the horizon burn red with morning light. He knew Jed McGraw was out there, somewhere in the canyon, and that sooner or later their paths would cross. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elias, the boy who had vanished into the night, was still alive. And he was no longer the same boy who had ridden with the Gold Fever Riders. The desert dawn came painted in crimson, as if the sky itself had been wounded in the night. Sheriff Kane stood outside the jailhouse, leaning against the porch post, hat low against the rising sun. Dusty Creek still slept fitfully after the chaos at the Silver Spur, but Kane had not closed his eyes. He knew too well what had begun. Outlaws could be dealt with. Bounty hunters, even. But gold was poison. It made men savage. It tore apart friends, towns, even families. Kane had seen it once before in the Black Hills, men stabbing each other over flecks no bigger than sand. And now, if the rumors were true, Jed McGraw had struck it rich in some canyon carved out by God's wrath. Kane had no illusions. That gold was going to bleed across the frontier. From the saloon across the street came the faint scrape of a broom and the low hum of a woman's voice. Delilah Byrne stepped out into the morning, her hair tied back, a shawl pulled around her shoulders. For once, she looked less like the queen of Dusty Creek and more like a woman weary of holding too many secrets. She caught Kane watching her and offered a thin smile. "You look like a man who's seen ghosts," she called softly. "Maybe I have," Kane said. "One of those riders spoke Jed McGraw's name before the lead flew last night. You want to tell me how you knew what that meant?" Delilah's smile vanished. She walked closer, lowering her voice. "I knew Jed, once. Long before he rode with desperate men. He came through Dusty Creek after the war, carrying scars deeper than his skin. Said he'd had enough of killing. But men like Jed don't get to walk away from blood. He always carried a hunger, something broken inside. I knew if he ever found something like gold, it would consume him. Cain studied her. And now every scavenger with a gun is chasing him. If the boy, Elias, was it, really lived, then the canyon's no rumor. Jed found something real. That means we're standing on a fuse waiting to burn. Delilah's eyes darted toward the horizon, where dust clouds gathered faintly in the distance. Then the fire's already coming. Far from town, in the labyrinth of the canyon, Jed McGraw's men stirred restlessly around their dwindling fire. The golden veins in the rock still shimmered in their dreams, a curse and a promise both. But Jed's patience was wearing thin. The canyon had become a prison. The Ute warriors circled them like wolves, leaving signs, arrows planted in the ground, smoke signals twisting in the sky. Jed's men were jumpy, every crack of stone an omen, every shadow a threat. And when fear mixed with gold fever, it curdled into paranoia. "We can't stay penned in here forever," snarled Doyle, his beard filthy, eyes fever-bright. "The Ute will bleed us dry one by one. We should ride for town, sell the gold, buy bullets and whiskey before we're corpses in this damned hole." Jed rose slowly, his frame towering over the firelight. His eyes were hollow, haunted, but they burned with iron resolve. "Town ain't salvation. It's a grave. You drag this gold into Dusty Creek, you paint a target on your back. Every outlaw, every mercenary, every lawman with a badge will come sniffing. No. We hold here. We wait. We fight if we must." "But the boy," another rider muttered. "Elias. He got away. If he reached the town, the whole territory will know by sundown." Jed's jaw clenched. For a moment his mask slipped, and grief cracked through. Grief for a boy he had promised to protect, who had once called him brother. "Then the boy becomes my enemy," he said coldly. "If Dusty Creek wants the truth, we'll give it to them, in blood." By midday, Dusty Creek was no longer quiet. Riders began arriving, dust on their coats, whispers on their lips. Drifters who had heard the rumors. Prospectors clutching pans and picks. Bounty hunters sharpening knives in the alleys. Gold fever was spreading, and Cain could feel the town shifting beneath his boots, the air charged like a storm about to break. In the Silver Spur, Delilah stood at her balcony, watching the crowd swell below. She knew her saloon would soon become the center of it all, where alliances were bought, where betrayals were born. But she also knew too many men were staring at the horizon, waiting for the spark. It came faster than she expected. A young rider burst into town from the north, horse-lathered, eyes wide with terror. His voice cracked as he shouted down the street, "The Ute are riding! They're driving McGraw's men toward Dusty Creek. They're bringing the fight to us." The street erupted. Men spilled from saloons, rifles in hand. Women dragged children inside, shutters slammed shut. The fever had found its fuel. Cain stepped into the middle of the street, raising his voice above the chaos. "Hold steady. This town's not a battlefield unless we make it one. You want to live, you listen to me." But his words drowned beneath the sudden crack of rifles. Dust rose on the horizon, black shapes galloping fast, warriors and outlaws tangled together, driving the storm straight into town. Delilah grabbed Cain's arm, her nails biting into his sleeve. "This is it. You can't hold them both back. If Jed makes it here with even a handful of gold, this town will tear itself apart." Cain's gaze hardened. He saw the truth of it in her eyes. He had sworn to uphold the law, but the law meant nothing against the tide of greed. This was no longer about badges or oaths. This was survival. The first riders broke into the street, gunfire shattering windows, hooves pounding the earth like drums of war. Dusty Creek screamed as chaos swallowed it whole. Cain drew his revolver. Delilah vanished back into the Silver Spur, her silhouette framed against the flames of lanterns overturned. And above it all, the wind carried a sound, a war cry, sharp and savage, mingling with the gunfire. Somewhere beyond the smoke, Elias watched from the ridgeline, torn between fear and fury. The boy he had been was gone. The canyon had carved something new into his soul. And as he saw Jed's face among the riders charging into town, Elias felt the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders. The gold had called them all, but Elias knew now, only blood would decide who survived its curse. The church bell tolled like a funeral knell as Dusty Creek tore itself apart. Gunfire rattled through the main street, echoing off the clapboard buildings. Horses screamed, windows shattered, and smoke from burning wagons curled into the sky. Sheriff Kane crouched behind a rain barrel, firing carefully into the advancing chaos. But for every outlaw he dropped, 2 more seemed to ride through the dust. The Ute warriors had not ridden blindly into town. They struck like lightning, swift and precise, arrows flying from rooftops, their horses darting down alleys like shadows. The townsfolk, armed with little more than shotguns and courage, fought desperately to protect their homes. And into this whirlwind of violence, Jed McGraw and his riders came thundering, caught between enemy and ally, gold weighing heavier on their souls than bullets ever could. "Sheriff!" A deputy stumbled into cover beside Kane, blood streaking down his cheek. "They're overrunning the north side. We can't hold 'em much longer." Kane gritted his teeth, firing again. "Then we draw the line right here. If Dusty Creek falls, there won't be a man, woman, or child left standing come sundown." From the balcony of the Silver Spur, Delilah watched the war consume her town. The saloon shook with every blast, lanterns swaying wildly as frightened patrons huddled in the dark. She had always believed herself a survivor, a woman who could outlast any storm by choosing her alliances carefully. But this was no storm. This was an inferno, and no corner of Dusty Creek would escape the flames. She spotted Jed riding hard down the main street, his men firing into the air to scatter townsfolk. His face was grim, eyes scanning the chaos for something, or someone. For a moment, Delilah's heart faltered. Once, long ago, she had cared for him. Now, she saw only a man hollowed by gold, willing to burn the world to claim it. Delilah's hand tightened on the derringer hidden in her skirts. "If it comes to it," she thought, "I'll put him in the ground myself." Out beyond the ridge, Elias crouched with the Ute chief, Black Elk, watching the town writhe below. The boy's heart hammered in his chest. This was his home, or what had been left of it. And yet, as flames rose and screams echoed, he felt a dark resolve settle over him. "They will all kill each other," Elias said, voice trembling but steady. "Outlaws, townsfolk, warriors. The gold has poisoned them." Black Elk's gaze was sharp, unyielding. Gold was never theirs to take. This land remembers. The canyon remembers. Blood is the price for greed. Elias swallowed hard. And if Jed survives? If he carries the gold beyond this canyon, beyond this town? The chief placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then it is you who must stop him. The canyon spared you. Perhaps it chose you." The word struck Elias like a hammer. Chosen. He had never thought of himself as anything but a survivor. But now, as he looked upon the firestorm of Dusty Creek, he felt the weight of destiny pressing down like a noose around his neck. Back in town, Kane's rifle clicked empty. He tossed it aside, drawing his revolver as an outlaw charged him from the smoke. The 2 men collided, grappling in the dirt, knives flashing. Kane drove his shoulder into the outlaw's chest, slamming him into a wall before shoving the barrel of his Colt under the man's chin. One shot ended it, blood spraying across the wood. Kane staggered back, chest heaving. All around him, men were dying, townsfolk, Ute, Jed's riders. And in the chaos, he saw Jed himself dismount, striding forward like a man possessed. Gold dust glittered faintly on his coat, smeared into the sweat on his face. "Jed!" Kane roared above the din. "Call off your men before there's nothing left to fight for." Jed turned, his eyes black pits in the smoke. "There's everything to fight for, Kane. You don't understand. The gold's ours, every grain, every vein. And I'll burn this whole town to ash before I give it up." The 2 men locked eyes across the street, both raising their guns. But before either could fire, a deafening crash split the air. The church steeple, struck by fire and shot through with bullets, gave way with a groan. It collapsed into the street, sending a storm of sparks and splinters through the fighters. Men scattered, screaming, as flames spread hungrily across the rooftops. Kane shielded his face, coughing through the smoke. When he looked again, Jed had vanished into the chaos. Delilah seized the moment. She gathered the few men still loyal to her saloon and barked orders, forcing them to bar the doors and drag water from the well to douse the flames creeping toward her livelihood. She knew it was foolish to think the silver spur could stand untouched, but she would fight for it as she had fought for everything in her life, fiercely, desperately, without apology. Then she heard a sound that froze her blood. A voice from below the balcony, low and familiar. "Delilah." She looked down. Jed stood there, his coat smoking, his eyes wild. In his hands he carried a leather satchel that glimmered faintly even through the firelight. Gold. He had brought it into town. "You and me," he called up to her. "We can leave this place. Start new, richer than kings. Don't waste yourself on Cain's law or these scavengers. Come with me." Delilah's fingers tightened around her derringer. For a heartbeat, she saw the man she once knew, the soldier broken by war, the dreamer who spoke of peace. But then her eyes fell to the satchel, to the gold that had turned his heart to rot. Her choice came clear as glass. But before she could raise her weapon, a gunshot rang out from the ridge. Jed staggered, the satchel slipping from his grasp. Gold coins spilled into the street, clattering like the bells of hell. Delilah gasped, staring at the smoke beyond town. A silhouette stood there, small, determined, rifle still smoking. Elias. The street froze for one terrible moment. Men stared at the glittering trail of coins scattered across the dirt, the promise of riches gleaming at their boots. Then the madness returned tenfold. They dove for the gold, clawing, stabbing, shooting each other in blind fury. Jed, wounded but not fallen, snarled like a beast, dragging himself toward the scattered treasure. His eyes burned with fury and betrayal as he locked on Elias's silhouette. "I'll kill you, boy," he roared, voice breaking with rage. "I'll bury you in this gold myself." The words carried across the battlefield, drowning out even the screams. Elias stood tall on the ridge, his rifle still in hand, the firelight casting him in shadow. And in that moment, every soul in Dusty Creek understood. The boy was no longer a survivor. He was a reckoning. The gold had come to Dusty Creek, and it demanded blood. The morning after the siege smelled of smoke, blood, and dust. Dusty Creek lay in ruins. Buildings still smoldered, blackened timber sagging against the pale light of dawn. Horses wandered loose through the streets, their eyes rolling wild, while the moans of the wounded drifted from alleys and shattered porches. The church was nothing more than a pile of charred wood and rubble, its bell cracked in two at the center of the ruins. Sheriff Kane walked the length of the street like a ghost. His hat was gone, his coat scorched, his revolver heavy on his hip. His boots crunched over broken glass and spent cartridges. Every face he passed, townsfolk huddled in doorways, mothers cradling bleeding children, old men clutching shotguns like lifelines, looked at him not with hope, but with questions he had no answers for. "What now, Sheriff?" their eyes asked. "Can you save us? Can you save anything at all?" Kane clenched his jaw, his hand tightening on the badge pinned crooked to his chest. He had sworn to keep this town safe. But safety had been burned away in the night, along with innocence. Dusty Creek had been swallowed by greed and blood. And still, Jed McGraw lived. At the edge of town, Jed dragged himself into the shadows of an abandoned livery barn. Blood soaked his side from Elias's bullet, but pain only sharpened his resolve. He stared at the satchel beside him, torn and half-empty from the chaos. Gold coins glimmered faintly in the dawn light, mocking him with their weight. He pressed a hand to his wound and laughed, a low, broken sound. "They think they've beaten me," he muttered. "Kane, Delilah, that boy. But they don't know what I've seen. That canyon still sings. There's more gold, more than they can imagine." His men, what few had survived, crept into the barn behind him. Hollow-eyed, bloodied, and desperate, they gathered around their leader. One spoke, voice hoarse with fear. "Jed, we can't go back out there. The Ute'll string us up, the sheriff'll hang us, and the boy's got half the town behind him. Maybe we take what's left and run." Jed's gaze cut through the man like a blade. He pushed himself up, ignoring the blood dripping from his side. "Run. You want to crawl back to nothing? You saw what was in that canyon. Enough gold to buy an empire, to carve our names into history. You think I'll let Kane or that boy steal it from us?" His men exchanged nervous glances, but the fire in Jed's eyes was enough to keep them tethered. Even broken and bleeding, he was a man possessed. A man the gold itself seemed to protect. Jed clenched his fists, his voice rising to a roar that shook the rafters. "We ride again. We take the canyon back. And when I've crushed Kane, when I've buried that boy alive under his own greed, Dusty Creek will remember the name Jed McGraw." Delilah stood at the balcony of the Silver Spur, her once grand saloon now scarred by bullet holes and smoke stains. The night had aged her 10 years in a single stroke. The men she once manipulated with a smile now staggered through the streets like wounded animals, broken by war and blinded by the shimmer of gold. She poured herself a drink with shaking hands, but the whiskey burned bitter in her throat. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed eyes she no longer recognized, eyes hardened, haunted, furious. Elias's shot had changed everything. The boy had struck down Jed when no grown man had dared. And with that single act, he had shifted the weight of the war. The town whispered his name already, some with hope, others with fear. Delilah turned from the mirror, her gaze falling on the derringer lying on the counter. She picked it up, weighing it in her palm. She had promised herself she'd put Jed down if it came to it. But she hadn't. The boy had acted where she had faltered. "Maybe the world's moved on," she whispered to herself. "Maybe Dusty Creek doesn't need survivors anymore. Maybe it needs martyrs." On the ridge beyond the town, Elias sat alone, rifle across his knees, watching the smoke rise. He felt no triumph in the shot he had taken. Instead, his chest ached with a hollow, gnawing weight. He had pulled the trigger because no one else would. But that choice had painted a target on his back brighter than any sun. He knew Jed would come for him, knew the gold's curse had bound them together like predator and prey. The Ute had withdrawn into the hills after the night's battle, leaving Dusty Creek to lick its wounds. Black Elk's words still echoed in Elias's mind. "Perhaps the canyon chose you." Chosen. He didn't feel chosen. He felt cursed. But as the wind shifted, carrying the smell of charred wood and gunpowder, Elias swore silently to the land itself. He would not let Jed McGraw carry the gold's poison beyond this desert. If it meant killing the outlaw, if it meant burning the canyon to rubble, he would see it done. Sheriff Kane gathered what remained of his deputies in the square. Only 3 answered the call. Their faces were gray with exhaustion, their eyes hollow. "We're all that's left," Kane said, his voice rough. "But we still wear the badge. That means something even now. Jed McGraw isn't finished, and neither are we." One deputy spat blood into the dirt. "Sheriff, half the town's dead, the rest ready to run. Maybe we ought to let Jed have his gold and ride on out." Kane's jaw tightened. He looked out at the ruins of Dusty Creek, the charred church, the shattered storefronts, the families picking through rubble. "This town has bled enough. We stand, or we die standing. No more running." The men nodded, not with hope, but with grim resolve. Kane felt the weight of his badge burn against his chest like iron in a forge. He was no longer sheriff of Dusty Creek. He was sheriff of Ashes. And he would carry that badge into hell if he had to. As the sun dipped low that evening, a riderless horse limped back into town, its saddle streaked with blood. The sight spread whispers like wildfire. "Jed lives," someone murmured. "Jed's coming back," another said. Delilah heard the words from her balcony, and her stomach clenched. Kane heard them in the square and drew his revolver, checking the chambers with steady hands. Elias heard them from the ridge, his heart pounding as he tightened his grip on his rifle. Jed McGraw was alive. And he was coming. The gold was not finished with Dusty Creek. The desert sky burned red as the sun bled into the horizon. Over the scorched remains of Dusty Creek, vultures wheeled lazily, their wings cutting black shapes against the fading light. The town below looked more like a graveyard than a settlement. Houses collapsed, saloon windows shattered, a church steeple lying broken in the dirt like the bones of a giant. Sheriff Kane stood in the center of the square, his boots planted firm on blood-stained ground. His badge caught the dying light, glinting faintly as if mocking the law it represented. Only 3 deputies remained at his side, and even they looked ready to break. "Jed McGraw ain't done," Kane said, his voice carrying through the smoke. "He's out there, licking his wounds, counting what's left of his gold. And he'll come back. He always comes back. One deputy, a wiry man with eyes too old for his face, spat into the dirt. Then let him. This town's already dead, Sheriff. Folks'll scatter by dawn. Why should we stay to die with it? Kane's gaze hardened. He lifted his revolver, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Because law don't run when things get dark. It stands. Dusty Creek deserves that much. The deputy fell silent, though his eyes betrayed his fear. Kane holstered his weapon, staring at the horizon where the desert stretched endless and empty. Somewhere out there, Jed McGraw was gathering his broken riders, and Kane knew the storm wasn't over. It was only gathering strength. Far beyond town, in a canyon lit by the last glow of day, Jed McGraw rose from the dirt like a revenant. His wound still burned, wrapped in filthy cloth, but his spirit was unbroken. He stared at the remaining gold scattered before him, and in his fevered mind, it shimmered like fire. The men who had followed him into hell now looked on with haunted eyes. They had lost brothers, friends, blood. But Jed's voice dragged them back from despair like a preacher at a funeral. "You saw it," he growled, pointing toward the shadows of the canyon walls. "More gold than God himself could carry. And now it's slipping through our fingers because of Kane, because of that boy. You gonna let 'em steal what's ours?" His men shuffled uneasily. One finally spoke. "Jed, we've bled enough. Maybe we take what's left and run before the Ute or the law finish us." Jed's laugh was wild, jagged, echoing off the canyon. He staggered forward, grabbing the man by his collar, blood dripping from his bandages onto the dirt. "Run. To what? Starvation? A noose? Listen here, you can't run from destiny. That gold is ours. Dusty Creek is ours. And I'll gut any man who forgets it." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. But none dared defy him. Jed had become more than a man. He was a fever. And fevers burned until nothing was left. At the Silver Spur, Delilah sat at the bar with a bottle of whiskey and a loaded Derringer. Her saloon, once filled with laughter, music, and smoke, was now a hollow shell. Tables overturned, blood staining the floorboards, the piano silent. She poured herself a glass with trembling hands, staring into the amber liquid like it held the answers. She had built her empire on charm and cunning, playing outlaws and lawmen alike. But the gold had changed the rules. It had turned men into wolves and left her caught in their teeth. Elias entered quietly, rifle slung over his shoulder, his face pale and set. He looked older now, his boyishness carved away by the rifle's recoil and the weight of survival. "You planning on drinking yourself to death?" he asked softly. Delilah looked up, meeting his eyes. "Maybe. Seems cleaner than waiting for Jed to come knocking again." "He'll come," Elias said flatly. "And when he does, we'll need every gun." Delilah studied him, this boy who had shot Jed when no one else dared. She saw the hardness setting into his bones, the kind that either made a man strong or broke him. "And you think you can finish him?" Elias's jaw tightened. "I don't know. But I know he won't stop until someone does." Delilah's laugh was bitter. "Careful, boy. You keep talking like that, and the town'll start calling you the savior. And saviors don't last long out here." Elias didn't answer. His silence was heavier than words. That night, Kane gathered what few townsfolk remained in the church ruins. Lanterns flickered against scorched wood as he laid out his plan. "Jed's coming. We all know it. We can't outnumber him, and we can't outrun him. But we can outfight him. Every alley, every rooftop, every broken wall, Dusty Creek itself will be our weapon." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mothers held their children close, farmers clutched rusted rifles, gamblers fingered knives with shaky hands. One old rancher spoke up. "Sheriff, why die for a town already burned? Why not ride out now and leave McGraw to his madness?" Kane's eyes swept over the faces before him. "Because if we run, Jed won't stop. He'll follow. He'll burn every town, every ranch, every soul that stands between him and that canyon. Dusty Creek may be ashes, but if we stand here, we can bury him in those ashes. For good." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of lanterns. Slowly, one by one, heads nodded. Fear still lived in their eyes, but something else too, resolve, fragile but real. In the hills above town, Elias kept watch. The moon cast a silver sheen over the desert, and in the distance, faint dust trails stirred. Riders! He felt the weight of his rifle in his hands and the weight of Black Elk's words in his memory. Perhaps the canyon chose you. Chosen. He didn't want to be chosen. He wanted a life free of blood and gold and the endless pull of violence. But the world didn't care what he wanted. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Jed McGraw's shadow grew larger with each heartbeat. By midnight, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear. The town was silent, every gun loaded, every soul braced for the coming storm. Delilah stood at her balcony, derringer in hand, her heart pounding. Cain paced the square, revolver at his side, whispering a prayer only the desert wind could hear. Elias lay on the ridge, finger resting on the trigger, eyes scanning the dark for the first spark of gunfire. And in the distance, Jed McGraw rode at the head of his broken riders, his eyes burning with fever, his blood soaking the earth, his laughter carrying across the desert night. The vultures circled lower. The final reckoning had begun. The moon hung fat and swollen over Dusty Creek, turning the ruined town into a graveyard of silver shadows. Not a sound stirred save the restless wind rattling broken shutters and carrying the scent of smoke from days past. Yet beneath that silence, hearts pounded, breaths quickened, fingers twitched against triggers. Sheriff Cain stood in the center of the square, every muscle coiled tight as wire. Around him, his deputies and townsfolk crouched in shadows, rifles aimed at the empty street. The saloon's balcony creaked as Delilah steadied her derringer, her face pale but unflinching. On the ridge outside town, Elias lay prone, rifle braced against a stone, eyes locked on the desert trail where faint dust swirled. And then it came, the low thunder of hooves. Jed McGraw and what remained of his riders emerged from the night like ghosts. Their eyes gleamed with madness, their faces hard with desperation. The gold had driven them to the brink, and now it demanded blood. At their head, Jed sat slouched in the saddle, his bandaged wound seeping, his eyes burning fever-bright. "Dusty Creek," he roared, his voice carrying across the still air. "You thought you could rob me of my birthright. You thought you could kill me. But Jed McGraw don't die. He rises. Tonight, your ashes will feed my fire." His men howled like wolves, the sound curdling the night. Cain drew his revolver, his badge glinting. "Steady," he whispered to his people. "Wait for the signal." The riders charged. The first shot cracked like lightning, splitting the silence apart. It came from Elias on the ridge, his bullet tearing through the chest of a rider and hurling him from the saddle. That was the signal. Gunfire erupted in a storm. Rifles flashed from rooftops, pistols barked from alleys, shotguns roared from shattered windows. Horses screamed and reared, men toppled into the dust, the square filled with smoke and flame. Jed barreled through the chaos, firing wildly, his laughter rising above the din. "Kill them all," he bellowed. "Burn this town to cinders." Cain met him in the open street, his revolver spitting fire, dropping a rider who tried to flank him. "McGraw!" Cain shouted, his voice raw with fury. "This ends tonight." But Jed only sneered, his teeth bared like a wolf's. "Ain't no law left in this land, Cain. Only gold. Only me." From the saloon balcony, Delilah fired her derringer into the melee, the shot grazing a rider's shoulder. She ducked back as bullets splintered the railing, heart hammering. For years she had danced on the edge of ruin, playing both sides of every fight, but now there was no game left to play. Tonight was survival, nothing more. "Damn you, Jed," she muttered, reloading with trembling hands. "Damn you for dragging us all into your hell." She peeked over the balcony again and froze. Jed himself had spotted her, his fever-bright eyes locking on her like a predator. He raised his pistol and fired. The bullet tore through the wood inches from her head. Splinters ripped her cheek as she dropped flat, gasping. For the first time in her life, Delilah felt the icy breath of death close enough to kiss. On the ridge, Elias worked his rifle like a machine, each shot deliberate, each pull of the trigger cutting down another rider. But with every body that fell, his chest grew heavier. Faces blurred in the gunsmoke, and he no longer knew if he was saving Dusty Creek, or damning himself to the same madness that consumed Jed. A rider broke free of the square, galloping toward the ridge, a pistol blazing. Elias shifted, his heart hammering, and fired. The rider tumbled, crashing against the rocks below. Elias lowered the rifle, his hands shaking. "How many more?" he thought. "How many until I become the same as him?" The battle raged savage and merciless. Dusty Creek became a furnace of fire and lead. Horses lay screaming in the dust, men crawled bleeding into alleys only to be cut down by a second volley. Smoke hung thick, the air choked with death. Cain ducked behind a trough, firing until his revolver clicked empty. He reloaded with practiced speed, sweat stinging his eyes. Suddenly, a shadow loomed, Jed McGraw, charging straight at him. Cain rolled aside as Jed's horse barreled past, pistol flashing. Bullets whistled past Cain's head, one searing his hat clean off. He rose, firing back, his shot grazing Jed's arm. Jed howled, blood spraying. But instead of falling, he pulled his reins and wheeled back, his grin wild. "You'll have to do better than that, Sheriff." Across the square, Delilah steadied herself, aimed carefully, and fired at Jed. The bullet clipped his shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. He roared in rage, firing blindly at her balcony. "Delilah!" Cain shouted. "Get down!" But she didn't move. She stood tall against the storm, her derringer raised, her eyes locked on Jed. If she was to die, she would die facing him, not cowering. Her courage cost her. Jed's next shot tore through her side, and she crumpled against the railing with a strangled cry. Cain's heart lurched, but there was no time to reach her. Jed was circling back for the kill. Then came Elias. From the ridge, he shifted his rifle, his eyes narrowing. He saw Jed, saw the madness in his face, the gold burning brighter than blood in his eyes. He felt the weight of every life already taken, every life still in the balance. He exhaled slowly, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jed turned, his pistol raised, aiming at Cain's heart. The moonlight glinted off Elias's barrel. One shot rang out. The world seemed to pause. Jed reeled in the saddle, his laughter cut short, blood blooming across his chest. His horse screamed and reared, throwing him into the dust. He hit the ground hard, rolling onto his back, his pistol still clutched in his hand. The battle around them faltered. Gunfire slowed, shouts faded. All eyes turned to Jed McGraw, the man who had become a fever, now gasping in the dirt under the cold gaze of the moon. He raised his pistol weakly, aiming at nothing, his lips curling in a final defiant grin. "Gold. It's mine, it's—" The pistol slipped from his fingers. His eyes went glassy. Jed McGraw was dead. Or so it seemed. The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire. Smoke drifted through the square, bodies lay broken, and Dusty Creek survivors stared at the fallen outlaw. Some wept. Some cheered. Others simply collapsed from exhaustion. But Cain knew better. He knew the story wasn't finished. Jed McGraw had been struck down before, and each time he had risen again, fueled by greed and hate. As he approached the body, revolver drawn, Cain felt the hairs on his neck rise. Jed lay still, too still. And then Jed's bloodied lips twitched, curling into a faint smile. His hand jerked suddenly, reaching for the pistol at his side. Cain's eyes widened. Dusty Creek lay smoldering under the pale light of dawn. Smoke drifted from blackened timbers, the acrid scent of gunpowder clung to the streets, and the bodies of men and horses were strewn like broken dolls across the square. The battle was over, or so it seemed. Yet a hush gripped the survivors, a silence thick with dread, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Cain stood over Jed McGraw's fallen body, revolver aimed steady. His boots were planted firm, but his hand trembled. Jed had been shot, blood soaking the dirt beneath him, his chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. And still, that wild grin lingered on his face, a grin that whispered he wasn't done yet. Cain's finger tightened on the trigger. "Stay down, McGraw," he growled, his voice raw. "Don't give me reason." Jed's lips parted, his words a rasp. "Gold, don't die." His hand twitched toward the pistol at his side. The sheriff fired. The bullet struck true, tearing into the outlaw's wrist, sending the gun spinning across the ground. Jed let out a strangled laugh, blood bubbling from his mouth. You think You won. His eyes flicked to the east, toward the distant canyon. The gold calls. And then his body went slack. For a long moment, no one moved. Dust hung heavy in the air, catching the light of dawn like smoke rising from hell itself. Cain finally lowered his revolver, his breath ragged. "It's done," he muttered. But even as he spoke, he wasn't sure he believed it. Delilah staggered from the saloon, clutching her wounded side. Her face was pale, her lips bloodless, but her eyes burned with a survivor's fire. She leaned against a post, watching Cain. "You sure it's done, Sheriff?" she asked hoarsely. "Or is he just waiting to crawl back out of the dirt again?" Cain looked down at Jed's still form, the blood pooling, the silence pressing in. He shook his head. "If he rises again, I'll put him down myself. But for now, he's gone." Delilah smirked bitterly. "That's what you said last time." Before Cain could answer, Elias descended from the ridge, his rifle slung across his back, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. His eyes swept over the carnage, the bodies, the broken town. When they settled on Jed, he frowned. "He's not finished," Elias said flatly. "Not while the gold still breathes." Cain turned sharply. "Gold don't breathe, boy. Men do. And he's done." Elias shook his head. "You didn't see what I saw. That canyon, it ain't just rock and dust. It's alive. It whispers. It takes hold of men, twists them. Jed wasn't just greedy, he was bound. And as long as that gold's still out there, he ain't gone. Not truly." The survivors of Dusty Creek gathered in the square, farmers, merchants, women with soot-stained dresses, children clutching their mothers. Their eyes were hollow, their voices hushed. The town was broken, but alive. Barely. Cain stood tall before them, his badge gleaming faintly in the weak morning sun. "We held 'em off," he declared. "Jed McGraw's finished. Dusty Creek still stands." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, clinging to hope. Others shook their heads, their fear too deep to lift. And one man, Harlan Price, a grizzled prospector with gold dust still clinging to his coat, spat in the dirt. "You think this is over?" Harlan sneered. "That canyon's still out there, spilling over with riches. Jed's men ain't the only ones who'll come sniffing after it. Mark my words, the fever ain't done spreading. It's just begun." His words struck like a spark in dry grass. Whispers flared among the people. Fear, greed, uncertainty. Cain raised his hands to calm them, but the unease had already taken root. The battle for Dusty Creek might have ended, but the war for the canyon's gold had only begun. That night, the survivors buried their dead. Lanterns glowed in the graveyard as shovels bit into dry earth, prayers murmured over shallow graves. The desert wind moaned through the headstones, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of blood and smoke. Delilah stood apart, her side bandaged, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had spent years surviving on charm, wit, and schemes, but none of that mattered anymore. The game had changed. Dusty Creek was no longer a town of whiskey and cards, it was a battlefield. Elias approached quietly, his face lit by lantern light. "You should rest," he said softly. She glanced at him, her lips curling into a weary smile. "Rest? When the devil himself is whispering in the rocks." "No, boy. Rest is for fools." She nodded toward Jed's grave, freshly covered, the dirt still loose. "Tell me true, does he stay in that hole?" Elias looked at the mound of earth, his stomach churning. In his dreams, he had seen the canyon, gold rivers gleaming under a red sky, voices echoing in the stone. He heard them even now, faint but insistent. He swallowed hard. "No, he don't." As the town slept, the moon rose high, cold and watchful. In the graveyard, the earth over Jed McGraw's grave shifted. It was slight, just a tremor, a breath, but enough to stir the night birds into flight. And from beneath the soil came a whisper. Faint, rasping, but unmistakable. "Gold mine." The next morning, Dusty Creek woke to betrayal. Cain had risen early, patrolling the square, when he noticed something missing, the strongbox. The last cache of gold, salvaged from Jed's men, was gone. Panic spread through the town like wildfire. Accusations flew, neighbors turned on each other, fists raised, voices shouting. It was Harlan Price who stepped forward, his hands shaking but his eyes defiant. "I took it," he confessed, the box at his feet. "You think I'd let it sit here, tempting every outlaw from here to the Rio Grande? No. I was gonna hide it, bury it in the canyon where no one could find it." Kane's jaw tightened. "The canyon? You damn fool, that's the last place it should go." But even as he spoke, he saw it in the faces of the crowd, the hunger, the fever. Harlan's words had lit the fire again. The gold wasn't a curse to them. It was salvation. Elias felt the whispers grow louder, pressing against his skull, beckoning him back to the canyon. He clutched his temples, his knees buckling. "It wants us," he gasped. "It ain't finished. None of us are free." Delilah stepped forward, her eyes fierce despite the pain in her side. "Then maybe it's time we put an end to it. Once and for all." Kane turned to her sharply. "You're saying we ride back into hell?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "Better to face hell than let it crawl into our town and eat us alive." The sheriff looked at his people, broken, desperate, afraid, and knew she was right. The fight for Dusty Creek was over. The war for the canyon was about to begin. That night, as the town made ready to ride at dawn, Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The whispers filled his ears, louder now, insistent. And in those whispers, he heard Jed McGraw's laughter, low, cruel, endless. The outlaw wasn't gone. He was waiting. Waiting in the canyon. The morning broke blood-red, the desert sky painted in hues of fire and ash. Dusty Creek stirred with grim determination. Men and women gathering rifles, saddling weary horses, sharpening blades dulled by too much killing. They were not an army, only survivors stitched together by desperation. Yet in their eyes burned a single resolve: the canyon must be faced. Sheriff Kane stood at the head of the square, his hat low, his badge glinting like a dying star. His voice carried over the murmurs. "We ride not for gold. We ride to bury it. We ride to end it. Any man who comes along should know, some of us won't return." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some nodded with courage. Others turned away, too broken, too afraid. But those who remained were the ones who had nothing left to lose. Among them, Delilah, pale but fierce, her bandage hidden beneath a crimson dress; Elias, gaunt from sleepless nights, haunted by whispers only he could hear; and Harlan Price, guilt-ridden, desperate to make amends. The sheriff looked at them one last time. "Mount up." And so they did. Dust rose as the riders left the safety of their broken town and rode into the desert, toward the place where fortune and ruin waited. The journey was merciless. The desert stretched endless, a sea of sand and stone where vultures circled above like patient judges. By noon, the riders reached the mouth of the canyon, its jagged walls looming like the jaws of some ancient beast. The air shimmered with heat, but beneath it lay something colder, an unnatural chill, a breath of death that seemed to seep from the stone itself. Elias shuddered, his hand trembling on the reins. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a chorus, 1,000 voices speaking as one. "Come closer. Claim us. Feed the hunger." Delilah rode beside him, her eyes narrowed against the glare. "What do you hear, boy?" He swallowed hard. "Jed. I hear Jed. And the gold, it's calling." Her hand brushed her pistol. "Then we best answer." They pressed deeper into the canyon. The walls narrowed, the light dimmed, and soon the riders entered a world where the sun could not touch. Veins of gold glimmered faintly in the rock, twisting like serpents. The ground glittered with scattered nuggets, too many, too perfect, as if the earth itself was bleeding treasure. And in the center of it all stood Jed McGraw. He was no longer merely a man. His body was broken, riddled with scars and wounds that should have left him in the grave. Yet he stood tall, his eyes burning like coals, his grin sharper than ever. His revolver gleamed at his side, but he did not draw it. He didn't need to. The canyon pulsed around him, alive, feeding him. "Well, well," Jed rasped, his voice echoing through the stone like thunder. "Sheriff Kane and his sorry riders. Come to take what's mine." Kane's hand hovered near his gun, but his voice was steady. "Not yours. Not anyone's. It ends here." Jed threw back his head and laughed, a sound that rattled the very walls. Ends. Boy, it don't end. The gold don't die. It's eternal. And now, it's me. The canyon shuddered. Rocks tumbled from above. The ground trembled beneath the horses' hooves. The riders faltered, fear sparking in their eyes. Elias shouted, his voice cracking, "He's bound to it! The canyon's his blood now. If we kill him, we kill it." Jed's gaze snapped to Elias, his grin widening. "Smart boy. But you ain't strong enough." The gunfight erupted like a storm. Cain drew first, his bullet grazing Jed's shoulder. The outlaw staggered but laughed, the wound sealing itself as golden light crawled across his skin. The riders opened fire, rifles cracking, pistols roaring, but every shot seemed swallowed by the canyon itself. The walls gleamed brighter with each bullet, as though feeding on the violence. Jed moved like a phantom, his revolver spitting fire, riders dropping one by one. Harlan Price fell with a cry, clutching his chest, the box of gold spilling from his saddle. Nuggets scattered across the ground, gleaming like stars fallen to earth. Delilah dove behind a boulder, reloading with shaking hands. "We can't kill him with lead," she screamed. Elias knelt in the dirt, clutching his temples as the voices screamed louder. Then he saw it, a fissure in the canyon wall, a vein of gold glowing brighter than the rest. The source. The heart. He staggered to his feet. "The gold! Break the gold!" Cain heard him, his eyes narrowing. He turned to Delilah. "Cover me." She nodded, rising with both pistols blazing, her fire drawing Jed's attention. The outlaw roared, striding toward her, bullets tearing through the air. One struck her shoulder, spinning her back, but still she fired, her teeth bared in defiance. Cain ran. His boots pounded the ground as he charged the fissure. With a cry, he drew his knife and drove it deep into the glowing vein. The canyon screamed. The walls shuddered, the earth split. A blinding light erupted from the fissure, searing the air, casting shadows sharp as blades. Jed froze, his body twisting, golden veins crawling across his skin like fire. "No!" he roared. "It's mine! Mine!" But the light consumed him, tearing him apart piece by piece, until all that remained was dust carried on the wind. The riders shielded their eyes as the canyon collapsed, boulders crashing, dust filling the air. Horses screamed, men shouted, the world crumbling around them. Cain pulled Delilah onto her feet, half carrying her as they stumbled toward the light of the canyon's mouth. Elias followed, blood dripping from his nose, his eyes wide with terror and awe. Behind them, the fissure widened, the canyon devouring itself, burying the cursed gold forever. At last, they burst into the open desert, coughing, bleeding, broken. The canyon behind them roared one final time before it sealed shut, leaving only silence. For a long while, none of them spoke. They stood beneath the burning sky, staring at the place where fortune had turned to curse, where greed had been swallowed by earth itself. Elias fell to his knees, weeping. Delilah pressed a hand to her wound, her face pale but proud. Cain stood tall, though his eyes were heavy with loss. "It's done," he whispered. "Truly done." Delilah gave a bitter laugh. "Funny thing. We came chasing gold, and all we found was death." Cain looked at the survivors, few, too few, and then back at the sealed canyon. "No. We found something else. We found freedom." That night, Dusty Creek was quiet. No songs, no laughter, no dreams of fortune. Only silence, and the faint hope that tomorrow might bring peace. But in the wind, if one listened closely, there lingered the faintest echo of laughter. Jed McGraw's laughter. The end. Subscribe for more stories.